In this unit, you'll be learning about bonds from the point of view of a corporation who uses bonds to borrow money from bondholders. As you recall, a company has a choice when they need money of using debt or equity to get that additional funding. Equity would be when the corporation decides to get that additional funding from either new or current shareholders. Debt is when a company decides to just borrow instead. Oftentimes, companies borrow from banks, other financial institutions such as insurance companies, or they may even borrow from a pension fund. All of those sources work really well if a business is borrowing relatively small amounts of money. If a corporation needs a really large amount of money, they generally choose to issue bonds. Bonds are like IOUs, and the beauty of bonds is that the corporation is basically borrowing from many separate individuals. The bondholders will be willing to loan the corporations money because the bondholders would expect to receive interest as well as get their money back. Bonds are generally issued by either corporations or governmental units. Our focus will, of course, be accounting for bonds when our business is the corporation that's issuing the bond. So what we'll be looking at is not bonds from the viewpoint of the investor, but bonds from the viewpoint of the corporation that's borrowing the money. We'll call those bonds bonds payable. Borrowing with bonds has several advantages, as you see here. First of all, bonds are debt. They're not equity. So unlike when a company issues stock, the ownership and, more importantly, the control of the company will not be diluted. The corporation, of course, has to pay interest expense on those bonds, but interest expense is tax deductible. If a corporation issues stock and decides that they want to declare dividends, dividends would not be tax deductible. And if the company is able to issue bonds with low interest rates, they may be able to take that money and invest it in projects where they will earn more than the interest that they have to pay on the bonds. That's known as financial leverage. Of course, there are some downsides to using bonds. The main one, of course, is that those interest payments to the bondholders are legal obligations and they have to be paid each period, or the bondholders could force the corporation into bankruptcy. If the corporation borrowed using equity, the corporation would never have to pay a dividend if it didn't want to. So using bonds is riskier than issuing additional stock. And the other disadvantage of a bond is that in general, in most bond payment arrangements, there's a very single large principal payment at the maturity date of the bonds, and those are terms we'll talk about in a little bit. There are actually many different types of payment arrangements with bonds. If you're a bondholder, you'll get a bond certificate or you'll get a prospectus on the bond that will tell you what the payment arrangement is on the bond that you're considering purchasing. The most common arrangement is the one that we'll look at the accounting for here, and that's when the bond issuer promises to the bondholder that they will make semi-annual interest payments at a fixed interest rate. We'll call that fixed interest rate a stated rate of interest, and the entire principal amount of the bond will be paid back as a lump sum at the end of the bond period. So for example, if a corporation issues a 10-year bond for $1 million and that bond pays 5% interest twice a year, that means that they're going to be making semi-annual payments, and at the end of 10 years they're also going to pay back the full $1 million of principal. These used to be called coupon bond arrangements because the bonds literally came with little coupons attached to them, and whoever wanted to receive the interest payment basically tore this coupon off the bond and took it to a financial institution and received their interest payment. That doesn't happen anymore, of course. Corporations just send the stated interest payments to the registered owner of those bonds. And this is the type of payment schedule that we will look at, and the only thing that you'll be responsible for in the course. In fact, as an additional simplification, we're going to, in our examples, assume just annual interest payments instead of semi-annual interest payments. As I mentioned, other types of bond arrangements exist, many others. In fact, there's only a couple listed here. There are serial bonds, and serial bonds, the principal amount of the bond is actually retired little by little in installment payments over the life of the bond issue, as opposed to all paid back at the end. There are zero interest bonds, so these bonds don't pay any interest at all. The bondholder simply gets their money back at the end of the period. So as you would imagine, if you were to purchase one of these bonds, you would not be willing to pay the full amount that you're going to get paid back in the future, because you would want to be reimbursed for the fact that the corporation had your money for some period of time. And also, bonds can have all sorts of features such as callability and the option for conversion to equity. Those types of bond features will be beyond our scope in this course. So let's talk just a little bit here about the actual process. If a corporation is going to issue or sell bonds, then they come up with a prospectus. So it's basically a little booklet or guide that describes who the company is, what the bonds are going to look like, and how they intend to use those bond proceeds. And that's where any potential bondholders or purchasers of the bond will find out information about the bonds, about the payment schedules, the interest rate, and all of this other information. The bonds actually are sold to investors through an underwriter. The bondholders basically receive, and anymore these are just electronic, a bond certificate. But this is really like an IOU from the corporation to the bondholder. The bond certificate, and these would be described as part of the prospectus, identifies what the face value of the bond is. Face value is often also called par value. We also call the face value or par value of the bond the maturity value, because that's the amount that the corporation is going to pay the bondholders at the end of the bond's life. So on that bond certificate would be the face value of the bond. I think if that is printed right on the face of the bond. It will also tell the bondholder what the stated interest rate is. That interest rate is stated right on the bond certificate. It'll tell the bondholder how often they're going to get their interest payments, and it will have the maturity date of the bond, and that is when the corporation has to pay the bondholder back the full face value of the bond. The amount of interest that the bondholders will get will be the face value of the bond times the stated interest rate. If the bond is paying interest semi-annually, you would divide the stated interest rate by 2. And as we said, at the maturity date of the bond, the corporation will pay the bondholders the full face value amount. The trustee of the bond issue makes sure that the corporation is fulfilling all of the promises that it made in the bond indenture or that bond agreement. So as we said earlier, bonds will have a stated rate of interest. That interest rate is chosen before the prospectus is printed out for the bondholders. So companies try to come up with an interest rate that's going to attract bondholders given the company's risk, reputation, and those kinds of things. Most corporate or government bonds, as I said earlier, pay interest semi-annually. We'll generally simplify and just compute annual interest payments instead, and that is just a nod to simplification. The periodic payments of interest that are made to the bondholders are computed by simply taking the principal amount, which in this case is the face value or par value of the bond, times the stated rate of interest times the time. If the bond pays interest annually, time would just be 1 year. If the bond pays interest semi-annually, you'd be multiplying by 6/12 for half of a year. So what would a bondholder be willing to pay for a bond? Bondholders are willing to pay the sum of two sets of cash flows. So if a bondholder is going to purchase a bond, they'd be willing to pay the value today of, first of all, those periodic interest payments. So they would compute what's the value of those interest payments today, and what's the value of that big lump of cash that I'm going to get at the end of the bond. If you add those two things together, that's what that bond is worth today. So that's the amount a bondholder would be willing to pay to the corporation. Because those payments aren't going to be received until the future, we need to discount them back to today. We need to consider the time value of money. The interest rate that we use to compute the present value, the value today of all of these future payments, all of these interest payments and the maturity amount, the interest rate that we use to compute that present value is the market interest rate as of the date the bonds are issued. The market rate will reflect underlying interest rates in the economy as well as specific risk related to this bond. Market rate is sometimes called the effective interest rate, the yield, and sometimes the true rate. That market rate of interest that we use to compute the present value of a bond, or the market uses to compute the present value of the bond, that market rate is also what we use for accounting purposes to compute interest expense that gets recorded by the corporation. We'll do some examples in a later video, and some of this will make more sense then, but let me spend just a few more minutes talking a little bit about the theory to give you some background on this. Let's talk a little bit about what that bond pricing would look like, or what the value of the bond would be to a bondholder. Let's take the instance first of all where the rate that is stated on the bond, the stated rate of interest, is less than the market rate of interest. So in this case, we're going to assume that the interest rate that's stated on the face of the bond is 6%. We'll assume that between the date that the corporation had the prospectuses printed and that kind of thing, the market rate of interest changed. So a company would pick a stated interest rate that they think correctly reflects the rate that they need to pay to attract bondholders. But underlying interest rates in the economy fluctuate from day to day. So this rate that's stated on the bond, no matter what the corporation intended, would probably not be the market rate when that bond was actually issued. Here we're going to assume that the market rate when the bond actually got issued for a bond of this risk is actually 8%. So this bond is only paying 6% interest on this $1,000 par value. For investments of similar risk, the bondholder could get 8%. So who's going to want to buy this bond? Nobody. So the corporation, in order to issue these bonds, the corporation would have to discount the price. The only way a bondholder would buy a bond that's only paying 6% when the market rate is 8% is if the bondholder paid less than $1,000. So when the stated rate of interest is less than the market rate, the bond will be issued at less than face value. The opposite kind of thing can happen as well. It could be that the company guessed that the correct interest rate was 6%. By the time the bond was ready to be issued, the market rate was only 4%. Well, what would you expect to happen in this case? For investments of similar risk, the company would only be earning 4% interest. This bond's paying 6%. That's going to drive the value and the price of the bond up. So this bond will be issued at a premium. Bondholders will be willing to pay more than $1,000 for this bond, because even if they pay more than $1,000, they will earn the market rate of 4% on this bond over time. Selling price, the issue price of bonds, will fluctuate in the market such that bondholders should always be earning the market rate of interest no matter what is printed on the bonds. So here's a summary of what I've talked about previously as to how we actually will be able to calculate the issue price of a bond. To get the issue price of the bond, as I said earlier, you're going to be looking at the present value of all of the cash flows associated with the bond. So that would be the present value of the interest payments and we'll discount those interest payments using the market rate of interest. The interest payments will be a stream of the same amount, so we'll compute their present value by just taking the present value of an annuity that's equal to one of those interest payments. We'll add that to the present value of the principal payment that's received at the end of the life of the bonds, and once again we'll use the market rate of interest to compute that present value. When you add those two things together, that's the issue price of the bond. Bonds will sell at par when the stated rate of interest is the same as the market rate. They'll sell at less than par, or less than the face value, when the stated rate is lower than the market rate, and they'll sell at more than par when the stated rate of interest is greater than the market rate. In the next video, you'll see some examples of this.